Hello out there, Fusion 360 fans, and welcome back to another Fusion 360 live stream. I'm your host, Jason Lichtman, and we have Brad Tallis on the keyboard for today's topic, the fundamentals of sketching. And I'm so glad I have you guys today to learn about the fundamentals of sketching because sketching really is the foundation of everything in 3D. If you have ever struggled to make 3D objects, you might want to look at your 3D modeling. But if you, what I really meant to say is that if you're struggling to be able to make the 3D models that you want to make, you should really look at your 2D sketching because 2D sketching is really the foundation of all things 3D. I can't say that enough. And so today's topic, we're going to be looking into that foundational skill, 2D sketching. We're going to cover all the basics of every aspect there is of 2D sketching. If you would like to learn more advanced 2D sketching capabilities or tips and tricks, look out for my video next week on Tuesday. That'll be at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. We're going to change that time slot up. But let's actually take a moment before we jump into sketching. Let's talk a little bit about where we're going with these live streams. So as you've already noticed, we are making this live stream from my home today. And we have all of the Autodesk employees working from home these days. We want to be able to give you as much great content as possible. And so for the next, actually, I would say it's indefinite. That doesn't mean it's forever. It just means we don't know the endpoint for it. But for the next little bit, we're going to be giving you more live streams than ever before. And I have the feeling you're going to really like where we're headed with this. So let me show you just a little taste of where we're going with it. Let's bring that up on that screen. And there we are. So this is going to be the live stream schedule for the next little bit. And what you're going to see is that Monday we're going to have Cam with Wayne and Devin. On Tuesday we're going to do design and engineering with myself, with Tyler, and with Wayne. Wednesday is going to be electronics day with Edwin and Jorge. Thursday is going to be Brad Tallis with his ongoing projects. And Friday is going to be the Cam with CJ and Al. That's going to be a little different format. Friday is going to be a little bit more of a hangout versus kind of more tutorial based for everything else. But in general, we're trying to give you as much great content as possible. So look out for some really great stuff coming your way. Let's get that off the screen here, and let's talk a little bit about sketching. As I said, that's going to be today's topic, and we're going to start off with the very basics. What is a sketch? A sketch is going to be a 2D, typically 2D, can be 3D actually, but typically it's a 2D flat representation of whatever you're trying to draw. But this isn't a hand drawing. This is going to be a collection of vectors. So vectors are going to be mathematical representations of shapes. So just as a quick example here, this rectangle that I just drew here has an equation behind the scenes that represents what this square is. This isn't a bunch of little dots like you would think if you design something in Photoshop, which would be a bitmap image editing or creating software. This is going to all be vector based. So a sketch is a collection of vectors. It could be squares, circles, arcs, or something much more complex. And you can use that to turn it into 3D in a variety of different ways. But like I said, the sketching is really the foundation or the building blocks to get to the 3D stuff. So if you're going to create a sketch, and let's go and delete this one right here for a moment. If you're going to create a sketch, what you need is to start off with something flat. So you have 3 planes to start with. You have this one right here. I call it the right plane, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you could see that it represents YZ. So between the green and the blue there, that'll be the right plane. This plane right here is the YX or XY plane. And then this one right here is the XZ or the top plane. And you can create sketches on any of these planes, but really you can create sketches on any flat object or face. So it can be planes, it could be the default planes that come in Fusion, or it could be planes that you create yourself using the construction planes. You could see right here. Either way would be fine. Just as an example, let's actually go back here. You can take it even further and you could actually draw your sketches on faces of objects that you've already created. So here I have what I call the geometric table. It's a super modern table here. And if you look at the very bottom, we know that this is flat. I can select it, and if I right click, you'll see that there's an option here for create sketch. So I could actually create the sketch on this flat surface. The same would also be true for the back over here. Let's do and you could see that there as well. And also the tabletop, but also includes in this case these three pyramids or triangle shaped areas at the bottom. So if you right click on it, you'll see create sketch, but this one is not actually flat. It might look flat at first, but if you look at it from the side, you'll see that there's curvature to it. I cannot create a 2D sketch on a non-planar surface or a non-flat surface. So when I right click here, I'm not seeing the create sketch option. So just know that you can create sketches on planes and you can also create sketches on faces, but they do have to be flat. Now, to get into a sketch, there are two ways to do it. Either select create sketch and then choose your flat face or flat construction plane, like let's say this one right here, and now I'm in a sketch on that right plane. Or you could actually right click on the plane or that flat surface. Let's go and do that. So I believe we said it would be the XY plane. Select it first, right click and say create sketch. So right off the bat, that's how you get into your sketches. Now, once you create a sketch, or start a sketch rather, you'll notice that the tab on the very top here is now changed. These are all sketch tools. And I have a sketch palette on the right-hand side with kind of like options. Generally speaking, I would say that everything that you're going to create is going to be up here. Actually, realistically, everything that you create is in the create drop down. Once you've created it, you would modify the geometry under modify. And if you want to add constraints, which we'll talk about in just a little while, you would add them under this constraints menu here. Now, if you're used to using Fusion from way back when, you would recognize that these constraints used to be part of the sketch palette, but they've been moved to this constraints area at the very top of the toolbar. If you watch one of the really old videos on Fusion 360, you might see those constraints on the right-hand side, but just know that they are all now at the top. So let's start off with the basics. The basics are what you're going to create in your sketch. And we're going to focus on the create menu. So let's go and start off a new file like this. And we're going to go and create a sketch. We'll try that other approach. So this time we'll do right click, create a sketch. And now I'm in that sketch menu. And here under create, you have all the different shapes that you might want to start with. We call these primitives. So I have lines, and you'll notice that there's a letter L next to it. That's the shortcut to make a line, keyboard shortcut that is. Rectangle has a letter R. Circle has a letter C. And even dimension, which we'll talk about later, is letter D. So these shortcuts are all meant to be as intuitive as possible so that you can just focus on creating and not worrying about which button does what. Now, when you start off with something like a line, you'll notice that you're just picking where your first point is, and it actually tells you next to the mouse what to do, and then specify the next point like that. And if you keep going, you're going to be connecting a whole bunch of these lines together, just like that. Cool. Let's go and do that again. I'm going to go and start that from scratch. I'm hitting L for line this time. And this time, I'm actually going to drag this, instead of dragging it at an angle, I'm actually going to drag this nearly horizontal. And you'll notice that a little blue icon shows up just to the left of my mouse. And it's telling me that if I click again, it's going to put this point here, but it's going to apply a constraint. And I told you later, we're going to talk about constraints in more detail. Just want to give you a little bit of a heads up that it's all going to tie in together. So I can create a line that's horizontal. I can create a line that's vertical, another one that's horizontal. But here's really the key. Until I connect everything together, I have what's called an open sketch or an open vector. Once you connect it together like this, you'll notice that when I let go now, it changes color on my screen. Now I have a little bit of like a blue hue inside of my sketch. And when I move my mouse over this region, it's going to highlight the perimeter in black. And that's telling me that I have a closed profile. Just so that you're aware, closed profiles, that's what you need to create solid models. So everything that's under this solid modeling tab over here, all require closed profiles, just like you see on the screen. But surface modeling, which is a little bit more advanced, that could be done with those open profiles. But if you're newer to Fusion and you're newer to sketching, then you should definitely stick with closed profiles and the solid modeling tab for making 3D geometry. Okay. If I select one of these lines and I hit delete, it's going to go back to open again, right? And you can actually see this white dot here is kind of telling you that you have an open area of your sketch. So let's go through again those primitives. So line is super basic. Let's go back to sketch. There it is. So line is super basic. Rectangle also basic. And you'll notice right away that I have 3 different kinds of rectangles. And for some people, that could be really confusing, but they're really all just rectangles. Don't stress out about it. The difference between those rectangles is just how you draw the rectangle. So in the 2-point rectangle, I pick a corner and then I pick another corner and it's the opposite corner and that's what it draws. With a, let's go and grab the other kind of rectangle, 3-point rectangle, I pick a corner, I pick another corner, and then I pick a third corner, right? In that case, it also wound up with a horizontal box. But the cool thing with the 3-point rectangle is you can also make angled boxes really easily. Pick one corner, pick another one that's not horizontal to the first, and now I can make a angled rectangle or a twisted rectangle, so to speak. The last rectangle, let's go and find that one too, is the center rectangle. And that one's as simple as the first point that you pick is the center of the rectangle, and then you're picking a corner of the rectangle. You'll notice, however, that there are some differences between these 3 rectangles. Let me get rid of this one so we don't have too many rectangles to compare. So this one here was the 2-point rectangle. This one that's now going to be in the middle, that's the 3-point. And then this one here is the center rectangle. And although they're all rectangles, you'll notice that these little icons, those constraints that are all the way around here, those are a little different. And this one also has this dotted line through it, which is called a construction line. But at the end of the day, don't let this kind of stuff confuse you, because if you just want to draw a rectangle, pick any of those 3 methods to draw a rectangle, they'll give you a rectangle. The same is true, by the way, though, for other shapes. So circle actually has 5 different kinds of ways you could draw circles, but again, they're all just circles. Arcs had to draw an arc, there are 3 different kinds of arcs you could draw. Polygon, there are 3 different ways you could draw the polygon as well. Each of these different shapes probably has a multitude of ways that you could draw it, but really they're just the same shape. So it's really your choice on how you draw it. Now let's get to the next topic I want to talk about, or at least focus in on for a second, is going to be something called the construction line. Those are the dotted lines you see on the right-hand side here with this particular rectangle. You'll notice that when I hover over this first rectangle, it highlights the outer edge and everything looks good. The second rectangle does the same, and the third does the same as well. But let's go and add a line that goes across each of those rectangles. And I'm actually going to just draw a big line that goes across all 3. So I'm going to go and draw a line like this, and I'm going to draw at an angle. And you'll see here that I now have that line that goes across everything. And the interesting thing about this line is that when I hover over that first rectangle, now I actually have 2 different highlighted contours. I have the top, and then I have the bottom. The same is also going to be true for this rectangle in the middle, top and bottom, and then top and bottom for the rectangle on the right as well. What's happening is that Fusion software is like calculating all the different closed profiles that can be made out of the geometry that's on the screen. And that line that's going across everything is splitting everything into 2 halves, the top and the bottom. That's why you can select the top or the bottom of each of these. You can select both halves, holding Control in between. You could actually select multiple of these. So you could actually just have only the top halves, or maybe it's only the bottom halves, or it's everything. I'm just holding Control to be able to group things together. But what if I don't want them to actually be split into 2? What if this line that I'm using that goes through the middle is kind of just helping me to be able to make the right dimensions or something like that? So in that case, you're going to want to turn this line into construction geometry. Select the line, and then on the sketch palette on the right-hand side, choose construction. It'll turn that line into a dotted line. And now that line still exists. It still has exactly the same size and dimensions, everything else, but it's not going to split your model using that line. So if I go back to that first square, now it's highlighting the entire square, the middle one doing the same, and the third one doing the same as well. So a construction line is still a line that's useful. It just doesn't split the model into 2 halves. Okay, the best way to get to that is to select that line and then hit that construction button. And if you would like to save even more time, the keyboard shortcut is the letter X. letter X, just like that. So select the line on your screen and hit the letter X, and it'll switch it from a construction line to a standard line, or from a standard line into a construction line. That easy. So this gets really useful for when you're trying to be able to create complex geometry and you want to be able to have dimensions from one thing to another. So as an example, let's say I have a picture frame I'm designing, something real simple like that. So I'm going to go and create a quick sketch. I'm going to go and create a rectangle, and maybe I'll use that center rectangle here. I can specify the size of this particular image. This is going to be maybe 5 inches, and this will be maybe a 3-inch by 5-inch. I am in metric right now, so let's actually change this since we're using inches. Great. Okay, so now I have a 3 by 5 image, and maybe I want to actually be able to make like matting that goes around this for the picture frame. So maybe I'm going to go and create another rectangle. Go and make this rectangle like that. And then I want a rectangle for the frame itself. And maybe I want, for example, this matting to cover up some of this picture. So now what I could do is I could put a dimension from the picture itself to the matting. Like this is how much matting is actually covering it. Maybe I want it to be like 50 thousandths. We'll do the same thing over here. Perfect. And then maybe I want to have the frame around all of this be about 2 inches. We'll go and set that as well. Perfect. Now at this point, I have a lot of different closed profiles in this particular design. If I move my mouse over this region, you could see that I could select this area here. I could select the area in between the two. I could select the smaller area. And I could use all of this to make a 3D model pretty easily. But the key here really is that I want to be able to extrude this region plus this region. And I can select both of those holding control, and I can extrude it. And that would work just fine. But if I want to save myself the time from having to select those multiple things every time, I can instead just take the size of the picture itself, I double select it there to select the whole loop, which is a great trick. And then I hit the letter X to turn it into construction. And now I only have to select this one thing. I don't have to hold control in between. So the construction geometry is a great way to be able to model things easily. And I'm an analogies guy, so I'll give you an analogy that I like to use. I like to treat construction lines like scaffolding on a building. So if you're building something or you're trying to replace the facade of some building, you would put up all this scaffolding so that you can get to the right places and fix that building. And then once you're done, you're not actually going to have the scaffolding part of the building. It's really just like a construction tool to get there. So use that construction geometry to be able to make whatever you'd like. So far what we've covered is how you can create your sketches, like the 2 different ways you can create it, what you can create it on, which is anything that's flat, right? Regardless of what the angle happens to be. If it's flat, you could draw on it. And then we also covered the primitives, which are the basic shapes you could start with. And then also the construction geometry, which is something you'd want to turn on or off to be able to split up those objects. But we're not done. We're going to get to the modifiers. We didn't really look at those yet. So the modifiers are going to be the things that take existing shapes and modify them, right? The only one that I would say is also a modifier that I don't ever see in this list is the delete button. You can use the delete button anytime you want. So if you want to get rid of, let's say, this construction line that's right here, select it and just hit delete, and it'll just go away. Same thing for this one as well. But what if you don't want to get rid of it? What if you just want to trim it? So in this case, let's actually go back to the last example where we have those boxes. If we want to trim this, I can go and use the modify, trim, and we'll zoom in here. If I want to get rid of this section here, there are 2 ways you could do it. And I'll show you each way so that you're familiar with it. Way number 1 is to highlight over the area you want to get rid of. It'll preview in red what it's going to remove. And when you select that, it's actually going to automatically remove that region. And you'll notice that what it did was it trimmed until the next intersection with something else. If I undo that and we go back to the trim tool, it's automatically trimming from the end here to this intersection that you see here. And if I highlight over this region, it'll trim just this region. Again, it's just using that intersection. Now, another trick, if you want to be able to do this really fast, is actually to click off of the line that you want to trim, or the object you want to trim. It doesn't have to be a line. and drag through the object you want to trim. You could actually just drag right through and it'll trim anything that it crosses. So I'll show you that in action a little bit faster over here. So if I wanted to trim, let's say this line, and then this line, and then maybe I want to trim this one, and this one, and I could wind up with some pretty interesting geometry really fast. Again, that's just clicking and dragging around. And it's basically like, running around with scissors, I guess. When you were a kid, they probably told you, your parents probably told you not to run around with scissors, right? To be very careful about using scissors. So if you just click on the individual lines, it's like being very careful and snipping exactly what you want. And if you click and then drag, it's like running around with scissors. Just be very careful, just like you would in real life if you had to run around with scissors. So be really careful, but it is very fast in Fusion to be able to trim quickly. So that's the trim tool. Now, you don't always want to trim. Maybe you actually want to extend something. So under Modify, you'll also see the Extend tool. It's the exact opposite of trim. It is similar though in how it works. When you highlight over a region, it's going to show you in red what it's actually going to do to extend. And what it's trying to do here is similar to before where it was trimming to intersections. It's actually trying to extend to intersections as well. So you can click here and it'll extend to the next intersection that it sees. And if you'd like to continue extending, you could just click again and it'll keep extending as much as you'd like. Right? So if I want to go and extend this one, I can go and do the same thing here and extend that until it matches. So that's like a quick and dirty on extend, right? Very similar to trim. You also have here break, and break is interesting. Break is actually going to split the object into multiple parts. So as an example here, let's look at this line. I have the line, it is going through an intersection right here, but you'll notice that this part of the line on the right-hand side of the intersection and this part of the line on the left-hand side of the intersection are the same line. The break tool is going to help you split it. So you use the break tool, highlight over the line that you want to split, like this region right here, and you'll actually see the highlight. And so when I select that trim, now I have a line right over here and a separate line over here that I could then modify differently. Like I could change the angle at this point and warp things and things like that. That's the break tool. Again, it's just breaking geometry into multiple parts. Sketch scale is going to be like a scale tool, but it only works in the sketch environment. There's a different scale tool for 3D geometry than there is for 2D. So sketch scale is the scale tool just for 2D. And the way that works is you select an object, like let's say this line here, choose a point that you want to use for reference for like the position for the scale, like this corner right there. And then using this arrow, you can actually warp in this case, the length of the line. Or in the case of, let's say, the rectangles, actually, let's go and grab, let's say this one here. We'll go to Modify, Sketch Scale, choose a point, and then grab that arrow. And now you'll notice here that it is kind of yelling at me or warning me that it's select sketch points or work points as a reference scale. So it's asking me where I want as a reference. And you'll notice that it's not actually letting me pick the geometry that I'm using for the scale itself. Sorry, that I'm trying to scale. So in this case, I'm going to go and pick another piece of geometry that's outside of it. And then now I can scale relative to that. Right, so that's generally speaking how that works. These numbers that you see here, by the way, are going to be between 0 and 1. And you can't use 0 because that would make this infinitely small. 1 is 100%, 0 is like 0%, right? But it's not possible. So 0.5 is going to be 50%, or like half size, so to speak. That's how scale works. And offset is a great tool, but it comes with some challenges, so be a little wary of that. Let's go and look at how offset works. So here I have a basic rectangle. This could be like the picture frame example that we talked about earlier. And if you wanted to go and make an offset or like a frame around this, you could go and make a rectangle. You could set a dimension between them. You'll notice that I'm going to end up having to set 2 dimensions, actually 4. One over there, one over here, one over here, and one on the bottom as well. Now I can make these equal to each other, and I could also set these up to be parameters. Those kinds of details will be covered in the next lesson on sketching, the more advanced sketching. But the key that I want to get to at this point is instead of having a bunch of dimensions, what I can instead do is use this offset tool, select the geometry I want to offset, and it'll automatically give you an even offset all the way around. Whether you're offsetting in or out, doesn't matter, it'll give you an even offset. One thing to know is that you can use the flip button to reverse the direction, which is just adding a minus in the offset position. And then you can also turn off this chain selection button if you don't want it to be the entire perimeter. So uncheck that and actually then reselect what you want. So in this case, maybe I only want 3 sides, and then I hit OK, and it's going to give me the offset on only those 3 sides instead of all the way around. So the chain selection button is great, but typically you're going to want to use that before you actually select your geometry. All right, let's move on. We have move and copy. This is going to be a great way to be able to say, you know what, this object that I have is already great. I want to make a copy of it, or I want to move it. So I'm going to go and turn on the create copy button, and I can also move this, and I'll have a copy of whatever that geometry is. I could put in exact values, and I could also choose a variety of different ways to position the new geometry. So that's just a quick way to move and copy. Now, just a little bit of a spoiler for when we're talking about 3D sketching, which will be the next lesson, is the move copy command also allows you to be able to move geometry in 3D as well. So there's just a little teaser. I'm not going to go into the details yet, but I can select, let's say, an individual point. Let's grab that point right there. And I could use the translate command, and I could actually move a point in space. And you'll see that now I ended up actually with a 3D object or a 3D sketch instead of 2D. So just be aware that that is possible. Okay. Excellent. And that is the modify command. Actually, let's go back into our sketch. We're not done. Great. Okay. Now, change parameters. This is a great tool. Again, this is something that we're going to cover in the next lesson for advanced sketching. But just so you know, the parameter table is a list of values that you can use for all your dimensions and things like that. And you can make these very complex. You could have like crazy equations and things like that. But these parameter tables are fantastic, especially when you end up with a model that is like a parametric model that's editable, where you can change the length or the height or the width really easily. This is the best way to do it. We'll cover that in the advanced sketching lesson next week on Tuesday. So here I have my sketch, and so far I've shown you all the basic tools to create the geometry, to turn some of the geometry into construction lines, to add modifiers to that geometry. So now let's talk a little bit about dimensions, right? Because we didn't really talk too much about them. So whenever you're creating a sketch, you're going to notice that the lines or circles or arcs, whatever it happens to be, are going to be blue by default. As you start to add enough information to them, they're going to turn black. And one of the ways that you can make that happen is by adding dimensions. Let's start from scratch. We're going to go and start with basics. Actually, we're going to design something. I've been making too many blocky things. Let's make a bearing flange as our example. So I'm going to start off by drawing a quick circle. I'm using C for circle on my keyboard shortcut. And we're going to go and draw a circle at the origin. So at the very center of my world. Just like I predicted and I explained earlier, my circle is blue, right? So um, there's no dimension to it, there are no constraints or anything. It's just a circle. Whenever anything is blue in Fusion, you can actually select it and you can drag it to make it bigger or smaller anytime you want. You can move it around typically, you can change the size, a whole bunch of stuff can change. When you want to start to lock down the size, you're going to want to add a dimension. The best way to do that is under Create, Sketch, Dimension, or the shortcut is the letter D on your keyboard. I'm going to go and pick the circle diameter, and I move off to the side, and then I select, and it's going to ask me or prompt me what size I want to have that circle, and we'll go with 50 millimeters for now. And you'll notice, like I explained earlier, that the circle now turned black, and black now tells you that it's fully defined. So let me explain what fully defined means. Fully defined means that everything in this circle is defined. It is fully defined. You don't have to guess what you want. So in this case, it knows that the circle's position is centered on the origin. The diameter is 50. There's nothing else you need to know about this circle. It knows everything. Let's go and make a rectangle around the circle, and you'll see how we're going to go and add dimensions to that one too. So let's go and draw our rectangle. I'm going to go and draw a quick rectangle like so. We're going to go and put in a dimension. The width of this rectangle is going to be, let's say, 100. The height of this rectangle is going to be, let's say, 75. And you'll notice that my rectangle is still blue, not fully constrained. And as a result of that, I can select any of these lines and I could drag this rectangle around. I can move this, not fully defined. Now, there are a couple of ways you can lock down the position, and I'll just go and show you the easiest way. I can take a corner like this and just drag it onto the origin, and it'll snap into place. And now I have my line work, or my rectangle in this case, also black, right? It's fully defined as well. And the reason that in general, engineers like me end up liking fully defined sketches is because if you end up making a really complex model, the last thing you're going to want is to accidentally drag something a millimeter or 2 or 5 millimeters off to the side and have your entire model blow up on you. So a fully defined sketch ensures that you're not going to accidentally move things around, and therefore your model is less likely to blow up. Generally speaking, I like fully defined. Now, a lot of people out there don't like fully defined sketches. Those people tend to be designers and artists because they like the ability to be able to drag things around and make it more freeform until they're happy with the way it looks visually. Then maybe they're willing to lock it down. Now, you don't have to lock down all your sketches, but I do want to explain what it means when you have a fully defined sketch. By the way, there's a good way to know if you have a fully defined sketch. If you look under your sketches folder and you look at the sketch that you're editing, if a little tiny red icon that looks like a lock symbol shows up, that means that the sketch is fully defined. That's what that icon means. If you don't have something fully defined, let me go and undo that, the position that when I drag that rectangle. Now I have it back to where it was. I have my lines are blue, and you'll see that the sketch symbol, instead of having the red lock, has a tiny pencil. The pencil means it's not fully defined. So again, it'll switch from a pencil to a lock as soon as you end up with a fully defined sketch like I just created. Perfect. So I added my dimensions between the width of my rectangle and also the height of my rectangle, but I want to go and place this somewhere, and I want to place it exactly in the center. So now we need to start talking about something called constraints. And by the way, at least in my opinion, a dimension is a form of constraint. It's a way to constrain the geometry. You're constraining it via a dimension. It could be a width, it could be a length, it could be an angle, it could be a diameter, it could be a radius, it could be all sorts of different things. But it's still a way to define and constrain what you're going to get. Now, there are other types of constraints that are more geometric based, and those kinds of constraints are going to be under the constraints folder right over here. And we're going to go through each of these one by one and show you exactly what they all do and how to use them. And I'm going to start with the one that I want to use right now. And we're going to start with actually, let's make some center lines, actually, and we're going to tie it all together with what we've already learned. So I'm going to hide the origin because I don't need that. I'm going to go and draw a line. I hit L for line, and I'm going to draw this line on purpose crooked. And I'm going to hit escape to exit that line tool. I'm going to do that same thing again. And by the way, if for all of you that are on the keyboard with Brad right now, this is the same method that I've seen Brad use quite a few times as well. If you draw your line and you draw too close to horizontal, it'll automatically add the constraint for you. But if you want to make sure that you're more deliberate about putting in that constraint yourself, then intentionally draw your line a little bit crooked like I am. And then you could apply that constraint and be confident that it's the exact constraint you want. So let's go and apply our constraints. The first thing I want is this line to be vertical. And I want this line to be horizontal. And you'll notice that there is a constraint here that says horizontal/vertical. It does both. And the reason it does both instead of just horizontal or just vertical is that you might actually be looking at something crooked. Like right now I'm looking at something straight on, front to back. But what if I want to twist my view slightly, right? What if I look at this from the side? This one I said we wanted to make vertical, but in this angle, it kind of looks like it should be horizontal. So the horizontal slash vertical tool is going to snap to whichever one is closest to, right? So whether it's vertical or horizontal doesn't matter. So if I select a line like this blue line and I choose that horizontal line, horizontal constraint, horizontal slash vertical constraint, it'll go and snap it to be vertical. And you'll notice an icon shows up right over here in the middle of the line. And that icon looks like part of this icon here, the top half. Let's go and do the same thing for this line. I select the line, choose the horizontal slash vertical constraint. I get this icon right over here next to my mouse, and that is the bottom half of that icon. Those lines just snap to be horizontal and vertical. Now, just like I talked earlier about construction, I actually don't want these lines to split up my geometry like this. It's actually going to make my life harder. So I'm going to select that line and hit X for constraint for construction. Do the same thing here as well. And now I have exactly what I want, and I have those center lines. Now, there are a lot of different constraints you could use here. So the one that I'm going to show you to start is the midpoint constraint. We're going to do these a little out of order. Actually, we're gonna do these out of order. So if I want to use, let's say, a midpoint constraint, one of my favorites, by the way, the midpoint constraint is going to lock down whatever choose to the midpoint of the second object. So in this case, I pick the point on the very top of this line, and I pick on this horizontal line, and it snaps them together. So now you'll notice that I now have everything centered. I still need to, I can move this up and down, but I can't move it left to right. So everything is already constrained. That's great. That's exactly what I wanted. But let's also lock this down vertically. Now I could do the same thing again. I could choose this midpoint constraint, choose the end of this line, and then this line, and it would do exactly what you'd expect. It's going to snap this exactly where I want it. But I want to show you another way to do it because like in most cases with Fusion, there are lots of ways you could do the same thing. So under constraints, you'll also see one here called symmetry. And the way symmetry works is you pick the first two lines you want to make symmetrical, then you select your symmetry line or your center line last. So let's go and do that. I pick the very top line, the very bottom line, and then this center line, and it automatically gives me the same result. The only difference is that the symmetry constraint did not force the end of this line to also be on this vertical line over here. So there are a couple of ways I could do that. And one of them will be another constraint. I can go and select the end of this line. And there's a constraint here called coincident. And I could select that and this line, and it snaps and it makes them coincident. Coincident means they take up the same place. They coincide in the same exact position, right? So you can make points end up on lines. You can make endpoints also on lines, endpoints on arcs, any number of cool things. So another example we'll go and show you is if I drew another line here and I wanted that to snap to this circle, I could draw it like this, select that point, select the circle holding control, and hit coincident. Now, another cool trick that I think will help you is that you can select the constraint first and then the objects you want to constrain, or you can select the objects and then the constraint. Now, there are pros and cons of each, and I'm going to tell you what those pros and cons are. If you select the objects first, the filter box will show you only the ones that you can actually do. So if I select this point here and I hold control and I select the circle, we go to our constraints, you'll notice that many of these are grayed out. Like midpoint is grayed out, collinear is grayed out, symmetry, curvature, perpendicular, parallel, tangent, horizontal, vertical, all of those are grayed out. The only ones that are reasonable at this point are coincident, equal. I'll admit, I don't know how equal makes any sense here, but coincident definitely makes sense. And I could then choose the coincident constraint. So it's making it a little easier for me to pick. The other method where you pick the constraint first is better in a slightly different scenario, which is maybe you have lots of different objects you're trying to achieve the same result on. So let's actually give another example. Let's go into another sketch here. And let's say I drew a bunch of circles, lots of circles. And I want to have these all be holes in some plate. So I'll draw a quick plate. And I want these holes to be the same size. Now, one of the ways I could do that is I could select all of these circles. I'm holding Control so I could select all of them. And I could hit the equals constraint, and it would just go and make them all equal. But what it's doing in the background is it's creating an equal constraint between two circles at a time. So it might be this circle and this circle, then this circle and this one, then this one and that one, or maybe it's actually this circle and that one, then it's the original and this one, the original and this one. You don't have any control over how that's working. So another way you could do this is you could go and choose the equal constraint first, then choose these two circles, then choose these two circles, then choose these two, and so on. What it's really doing is it's continuing to use that equals constraint until you're done, until you decide you're done. If you're going to do a lot of the same constraint over and over again, I would recommend you actually use the constraint first and then select whatever the objects are. But there are pros and cons. So let's look at the list again, right? We started by showing you horizontal and vertical. I also showed you the symmetry constraint. I also showed you the coincident constraint, and I just showed you the equal constraint. But we're not done. There are quite a few other constraints here. Tangent is one that I really like. So tangent is going to allow you to make an arc and another arc, or an arc and a line, be able to be tangent to each other. So just barely touching. So as an example here, I can go and use tangent, select this circle, select this line, and now you'll see that they are perfectly touching. Now this might not be an exactly practical case that you see here, but I'll show you one that is practical. So let's say you wanted to design some sort of slot. So there is a slot tool. So if you go back to those primitives, you'll see that I have 5 different ways you could draw a slot. But if for whatever reason you wanted to draw that manually, you could just go and draw a rectangle, draw a circle like that. I'll draw another circle like this over here. And then I can go and apply that tangency constraint. So this line and that circle, this line and this circle. Then I'll do the same thing over on this end, just like that. And now what I might want to do is delete these lines. And I also might want to trim my sketch. These are exactly the same tools I've already shown you, but now they're starting to come to life, right? I could trim this as well, trim this, zoom in, trim that area right there, and this one, and now I have a slot created manually. So the idea here is simply that the tangent constraint is a great way to be able to make things tangent. It's not just for like circle and squares to be next to each other, but it could also work for arcs as well. So just one more last one. If I wanted to make an arc here and I wanted those to just barely touch each other, again, we're going to go and use that tangent constraint. Perfect. So let's go a little further. Equal, we've already shown, we'll make two objects equal. Parallel will make them parallel. So if I have two lines like this, and they are not exactly parallel, use that parallel command, choose those lines, and now they're going to be parallel to each other. Perpendicular is pretty straightforward as well. If you wanted this line to now be perpendicular to that one, choose that perpendicular constraint, choose those two lines, and now you have the perpendicular constraint. Now, the same is also going to be true for concentric. That's going to be for two arcs or circles. Let's go and show you that. So if I have two random circles and I want to make them concentric, again, I could choose those circles and they'll automatically be concentric relative to each other. It doesn't have to be a circle to a circle. It can also be an arc. So here's an example, because an arc is really just a partial circle. So let's go and choose concentric, arc, and the circle, and those will also be concentric just like that. The same is also true with multiple arcs as well. So let's go and do that one more time. We're going to go and make another arc, and we'll go and select those two and the concentric constraint. And in this case, they're overlapping each other quite a bit, but they are indeed concentric. Collinear is going to be for straight things, right, to make them the same line. So if you have a line like this, and you have another line, and you actually want them to be the same line, select both of those, and then choose the collinear option, and they will be the same line. right? It's like doing parallel, but then also coincident together. But if you wanted to be able to do this more manually, you could go and let's angle that a little bit. I could make these parallel, right? And now they're slightly off from one another. Then I could use, let's say, this line and this point and make them coincident. And now this is essentially the same thing as collinear, right? But it's is another way to do the same thing. And lastly, we have one for curvature. And this is going to be for G2 surface continuity. This is like ultra smoothness. So if you, let's try to make this simple without getting too crazy. If I have a box and I go and I add a fillet to it like this transition from line to arc is called G1 continuous or G1 curvature. It's a smooth transition, but not as smooth as a G2 smoothness, right? As light bounces off of this geometry, in particular the 3D model that this would create, it bounces off a little funny. So curvature is a constraint that you could use mostly with like splines and kind of more advanced shapes to be able to make the super smoothness. But generally speaking, these constraints plus the dimension tool will allow you to fully define all of your geometry so that you can create anything that you'd like. And that's really the key. Now, these icons that you see here next to the lines, those are the constraints themselves. If at any point you're not happy with one of those constraints, simply select the icon and hit the delete button, right? And to be clear, don't select the line and hit delete, because that'll delete the line. Select the actual constraint and hit the delete button, and it'll delete for you. Once it's deleted, the geometry itself isn't fully defined anymore, and now you could go and modify it. So once the horizontal or vertical constraint isn't there, now we could go and pick an angle for that geometry. You could do some pretty cool stuff here. So the key really is start with the primitives that you like, right? Rectangles, circles, slots, arcs, whatever it is you want. You modify it using the modifiers. Oh, and you know what? I completely forgot to show you fillet before. I showed it a moment ago, but a fillet is going to automatically create a filleted corner, right? It's adding an arc in the corner for you automatically. You're going to go and modify the geometry until you're happy with it. And it's going to be a collection of primitives, modifiers, constraints, and dimensions to be able to make everything that you want. And so let's look at an example of a sketch that I created for a project. So here I have a tray. And here I have this tray, and you can see here I have my sketch. And in my sketch, I have dimensions. I also have construction geometry, and I have something else that we haven't talked about. And you'll notice that I have this magenta line work in here. And if any of you haven't seen the magenta line work, the magenta lines are projected geometries. So that's geometry that's from another sketch or a 3D model that you're going to use in this sketch. So let's give you a practical example, and we'll show you how this works. I'm going to show you two scenarios of projected geometry. So let's say you start off with a new design. And we're going to go and create something like that bearing flange that we started with, right? So we have a circle, we have a rectangle, and I'll make this a little easier on me this time. We're going to add filleted corners, just like this. And let's make this quite a bit smaller. No, just fine. And that's looking pretty good. So now I have this geometry, and I didn't even turn it into a 3D model yet. It's still just a sketch. But maybe I want to start to make another sketch, and I want to have the positions of everything correctly. So let's maybe make a construction plane. So I'm going to make an offset plane, and we're going to make this higher up in space, maybe 100 millimeters taller. And we're going to create a sketch on this plane. Now, for this particular sketch, we're going to end up using the position of those arcs because I want to line up maybe holes through the model. And I want to line them up right here. So what I could do is I could actually project geometry from the first sketch into the second. That's what the projected geometry is. You'll find that under Create, Project, and then there's the project button. Now there are a variety of other projection tools, and we'll cover those in the advanced sketching class next week on Tuesday. But for now, we're going to stick with just the project button at the very top. There are two options here. Specified entities, which is really just you saying, I want to pick exactly what I want to project. Or there's the option for bodies, which will take an entire object. And we'll cover that in a moment. For now, we're going to go and use this purple option. I'm going to choose that arc. I'll choose all 4 of those arcs. And I'll hit OK. And what it now did is it projected the geometry on the plane that I was actually sketching. So it's the same arc that you see down below, but it's elevated by whatever the height is of that plane. And you can see I have the arc itself, and I also have the center. So if all I care about is the center points, I could make this all match up. All I have to do is draw my circle, or whatever it is my hole is going to be. And I'm drawing it at like an angle, like we're looking at an angle. I could also just go and look at this from above here. I'm going to go and set some constraints. So maybe I want all 4 of these to be equal to each other, and we can make that much smaller. Here we are. I can go and put in a dimension for those circles, maybe make this 25 millimeters, something like that. And I can now use this later to be able to make my cut. Now, if something I projected happens to go through this, right, let's go and project the center line from the last sketch. Now I have this pink or magenta line going across. Oh, and by the way, let's hide the original sketch. So we were just looking at this new one. Again, just like we were showing in the original, any line that crosses another object is going to turn this into profiles. I have this left half, I have the right half. If I don't want that to be the case, I can select even that magenta projected geometry, and I could use the construction toggle, and now I have that as construction geometry. So that might allow me to be able to make some sort of geometry between these two really easily. You could also do the same thing with these arcs. I'm just selecting them and hitting the X button on my keyboard, and now those are construction geometry as well. So this is a case where you have a projected geometry from another sketch. And by the way, they don't have to be on different planes. So you could have all of this be on the same exact plane. You could just work in one sketch plane for everything and just have a sketch that represents the holes you're going to drill through this model, a separate sketch that's going to represent like the ribs you want to put on this model, a separate sketch that's going to have all sorts of other things, right? One of the keys here is some people think that you should put absolutely everything in your model into one sketch. And I would say I don't exactly recommend that. If your sketch is too complex, it could slow down your performance quite a bit. So don't feel like you have to have everything in a single sketch, because you could always reuse something you created in the first sketch in another sketch, like I'm showing you on the screen right now. So here's another example. You can also project geometry from the model itself, from a 3D model. Let's go and grab our table example. Let's go and create a new sketch. We're going to create a sketch on the center line. So let's go and grab our XY plane, create a quick sketch. And I'm going to rotate this around so you could actually see this a little bit more clearly. The plane that I want you to see is this plane. And we could go and look at that a little bit better. There we go. Oh, wrong one. There it is. And I'm going to go and make a projection of my model. So I hit P on my keyboard. That's the shortcut. I'm still under that purple option for specified entities. That allows me to pick, do I want to project this flat face? Do I want to project this edge? Which, by the way, looks like it's going to give me exactly the same result, right? But I'm selecting 2 different things. Or I could say, you know what? I want a projection of the whole object, the whole body. And that would be this white option here, this white solid body. I can select the object, and it's going to create a silhouette of that object. And when I hit OK, I have a magenta silhouette. Let's hide the body for a second. Let's actually hide all the previous sketches as well. And here you could see that projection. And it is a closed profile. I can extrude this. I could do all sorts of things with it and use this. Now, one thing to keep in mind with projections that I haven't talked about yet is that projections are limited in your ability to extend them or to trim them. So if I end up drawing a line that goes across this table and I want to trim this particular magenta line, it's not actually going to let me do it. Will it let me trim the new geometry that I create around it? Absolutely. So I can trim this edge, and now I have a line that just goes across the magenta areas, but I cannot trim the magenta line. So keep that in mind, that's really important. You also cannot extend those magenta projected lines as well. So let's go to Modify and Extend, and you'll hover over one of these magenta lines like this one, and you'll notice that it's not going to give me any preview for extending this line. So just a little trick if you do need to extend or trim this line is you can make this a projected, sorry, it was already projected. You can make this a construction line by hitting that X button. Then you could draw a new line in its place like this, using those same constraints like I showed you earlier, like this one, collinear. And now I have a new line that is representing the exact position of the original, but this one is extended and I can drag this wherever I'd like. That's one way to achieve it, but cannot extend and you cannot trim any of those projected geometry. So let's talk a little bit about like big picture so far. So this is a complex topic. That's why we're doing a live stream all about like the basics to start, right? You start off with creating sketches. Actually, let's talk big picture for a sec. There we are. So you create your sketches on any flat face. It could be a 3D model, has a flat face. It could be a plane. It could be the default planes. It could be new planes. You create that sketch, and then once you create that sketch, you're creating a bunch of geometry. Rectangles, circles, arcs, lines, they're all vectors. They're all mathematical based. You can modify those lines you create by extending them, by trimming them, by adding dimensions to them, by adding constraints to them. And once you end up with the geometry that you want, then you're going to turn that into 3D. So when I talked earlier about how sketching is really the foundation of all things 3D, this is why, right? If you have trouble creating the 3D geometry that you want, take a look at your sketching practices. If you're having trouble sketching, it's not going to be a big surprise you're going to have trouble with 3D modeling as well, right? So really focus on that foundation. Have that foundation be strong so that everything else that you're building on top of it is going to be rock solid as well, right? Your sketching is going to be something that you're going to have to work on, to practice. Practice makes perfect. And the best way is actually to model things that you've already modeled and remodel them over and over and over again. You'll get better and better at them every single time you do. Just keep in mind that it's always a combination of those dimensions and constraints to be able to get the geometry you want. Whether it happens to be a table, or it's going to be a bearing flange, or a medical device, or a 3D printed part for your own home. Anywhere and everywhere is going to involve some sketching. So I urge you to practice your sketching. And if you liked what you saw in today's video, please make sure to like this actual video. There's a like button. You should hit that like button. Share this video with other people as well. And if you also liked what you saw this week, then stay tuned for next week, Tuesday, I don't see the date in front of me, but next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, we're going to be back with another live stream on sketching. This one is going to be advanced. We're going to cover everything from 3D sketching to all the different ways you could project geometry. There are several other ones I didn't show you yet. And we'll cover some more complicated geometries like splines, how spline handles work, and a whole lot more. So stay tuned next week. It has been my absolute pleasure to talk to you today about fundamentals of sketching. And don't forget, with Fusion 360, you can make anything. Thank you so much for your time today.